What was that sound? Dr. Elena Vasquez whispered, her heart pounding as she heard desperate whimpering echoing through the Colombian rainforest. The wildlife veterinarian had come to this remote research station expecting routine medical checkups on captured animals, but she discovered that humid morning would bind her to a spotted predator in ways that defied every protocol she'd learned in 15 years of conservation work. Years later, when armed poachers cornered her in this same jungle with nowhere to run, that bond would mean the difference between life and death. Under the dense canopy of the Chaco rainforest, Dr. Elena Vasquez was conducting her weekly rounds at the remote Wildlife Rehabilitation Center when an unusual cry pierced through the typical chorus of howler monkeys and tropical birds. The sound was coming from the quarantine enclosure, where new arrivals were kept isolated before being cleared for the main facility. Elena had been working in wildlife conservation across Central and South America for over a decade, but she'd never heard a vocalization quite like this one. Following the sound to a reinforced concrete enclosure partially hidden by hanging vines and massive cecropia trees, Elena peered through the observation window. Inside, pacing frantically along the far wall, was a leopard cub no more than 4 months old. His rosette-spotted coat was dull and patchy, and even from a distance she could see his ribs protruding beneath loose skin. The cub's amber eyes held a wild desperation as he called out repeatedly, a sound somewhere between a house cat's meow and the deeper rumble that would one day become a leopard's growl. Elena checked the intake records on her tablet. The cub had been confiscated from illegal wildlife traders 3 days ago, found crammed into a wooden crate barely large enough for a domestic cat. No mother, no siblings, just this solitary youngster who should still be nursing and learning to hunt under his mother's protection. The veterinary notes indicated he was severely malnourished and dehydrated, but physically uninjured. What concerned Elena more was his behavior. Instead of the fearful aggression most big cats displayed in captivity, this cub seemed to be actively seeking attention, pressing against the bars whenever footsteps approached. Most rescued big cat cubs either cowered in corners or attacked anything that moved. This one was different. When Elena approached the enclosure door, the cub stopped pacing and fixed his golden eyes on her with an intensity that seemed almost human. He made a soft chirping sound, completely unlike the aggressive snarls she expected from a wild predator. Elena knew the protocol by heart. Big cats, especially leopards, were to be handled with minimal human contact to preserve their wild instincts for eventual release. But something about this cub's condition made her pause. The previous veterinarian had left detailed notes indicating the animal was refusing to eat, having gone nearly 4 days without consuming anything substantial. In the wild, a cub this young would still be dependent on its mother's milk, gradually transitioning to regurgitated meat. This one had been thrust into independence far too early. Against her better judgment, Elena decided to enter the enclosure. She moved slowly, keeping her body language non-threatening, while carrying a bottle of specialized big cat formula the center used for emergency situations. The moment she stepped inside, the cub's behavior shifted dramatically. Instead of retreating or showing aggression, he approached with cautious curiosity, his small paws making barely audible sounds on the concrete floor. What happened next would replay in Elena's mind for years to come. The cub walked directly to her feet and began rubbing against her legs, purring with a rumbling intensity that vibrated through her bones. This was the behavior of a domestic cat seeking comfort from its owner, not a wild predator maintaining appropriate distance from humans. When she knelt down with the bottle, he latched onto it immediately, drinking with desperate hunger while maintaining eye contact with her throughout the feeding. Elena tried to convince herself this was purely professional, a necessary intervention to save a dying animal. But as she watched the cub's tense body finally relax for the first time since his arrival, she felt something shift inside her chest. This wasn't just another case file. When the bottle was empty, instead of retreating to his usual corner, the cub curled up directly beside her, pressing his small body against her thigh, as if seeking the warmth and protection his mother would have provided. The Rehabilitation Center's director, Dr. Martinez, had specifically instructed all staff to maintain strict boundaries with the big cats. Human imprinting could render an animal unreleasable, essentially condemning it to life in captivity. But as Elena sat in that enclosure, feeling the steady rise and fall of the cub's breathing as he slept peacefully for the first time in days, she made a decision that would challenge every principle of wildlife rehabilitation she'd ever learned. She would return tomorrow, and the day after that, until he was strong enough to survive on his own. Elena named him Sombra, after the way his spotted coat seemed to blend seamlessly with the dappled shadows of the forest floor. Each morning she would arrive at the center before dawn, her backpack loaded with bottles of formula, raw meat portions, and increasingly her camera to document his remarkable recovery. The other staff members had begun to notice her extended time in the quarantine section, but Elena justified it as necessary medical monitoring for such a critically malnourished animal. By the second week, Sombra had gained nearly 3 pounds, and his coat had begun to regain its lustrous shine. More importantly, he had started exhibiting playful behaviors that indicated his psychological recovery. Elena would bring enrichment toys, watching with fascination as he practiced stalking and pouncing on stuffed animals designed to simulate prey. His natural hunting instincts were emerging, but they were directed toward objects that Elena provided rather than developing through observation of his mother's techniques. The feeding routine had evolved into something far more complex than simple nutrition. Sombra would wait by the enclosure door each morning, recognizing the sound of Elena's footsteps on the gravel path long before she came into view. When she entered, he would perform what she privately called his greeting ritual, standing on his hind legs to place his front paws on her shoulders, purring while gently headbutting her face. This behavior, while endearing, was deeply concerning from a conservation standpoint. Wild leopards maintain careful distance from humans, viewing them as potential threats rather than sources of comfort and food. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Elena began spending entire afternoons in Sombra's enclosure, ostensibly to monitor his development, but increasingly because she found herself genuinely enjoying his company. He would follow her around the space, mimicking her movements and bringing her leaves or small sticks as if offering gifts. When she sat to write her observation notes, Sombra would position himself beside her, sometimes draping his growing body across her lap like an oversized house cat seeking attention. The boundary between professional duty and personal attachment was dissolving rapidly. Elena found herself declining invitations to join colleagues for evening activities, preferring to spend those hours with Sombra. She had begun talking to him during their time together, explaining her day's work or sharing thoughts about conservation challenges she faced. Most remarkably, Sombra seemed to listen, tilting his head and responding with soft chirps and rumbles that felt almost conversational. Her colleagues might have dismissed this as anthropomorphization, but Elena sensed an intelligence and emotional connection that transcended typical animal-human interactions. 3 months into their relationship, Elena began to notice troubling changes in Sombra's behavior that extended far beyond normal human habituation. He had grown considerably, now weighing nearly 40 pounds with the muscular build of a juvenile leopard approaching independence age. Yet, instead of developing the natural wariness that should accompany this growth, Sombra had become increasingly demanding of Elena's attention and presence. The most concerning development was his reaction to Elena's absences. When she traveled to conduct field research in other parts of the country, the center staff reported that Sombra would refuse to eat for days, pacing his enclosure constantly and vocalizing with distressed calls that could be heard throughout the facility. Upon her return, he would display behavior that bordered on possessive, refusing to let her leave his enclosure without following her to the door and attempting to push through the barriers. Dr. Martinez had begun asking pointed questions about Elena's methodology during their weekly staff meetings. Other veterinarians at the center were handling multiple big cat cases with standard protocols, maintaining appropriate distance while still providing necessary medical care. Elena's extended daily sessions with Sombra were becoming impossible to justify as routine veterinary monitoring. When pressed for documentation of his progress toward release readiness, Elena found herself making excuses about his need for additional socialization and behavioral development. The situation reached a critical point when Elena discovered Sombra attempting to follow her scent trail beyond his enclosure. He had learned to recognize not just her footsteps and voice, but her specific smell, becoming agitated whenever he detected traces of her presence in areas he couldn't access. The facility's security cameras captured footage of him pressing against the enclosure walls whenever Elena was working in adjacent areas, even when he couldn't see her directly. More alarming was Sombra's response to other staff members. He had begun displaying territorial behavior, snarling and showing aggressive postures when anyone other than Elena approached his space. What had started as a preference for her company had evolved into an exclusive bond that made him potentially dangerous to other caretakers. The veterinary technician assigned to clean his enclosure reported feeling threatened by Sombra's intense staring and low growling whenever Elena wasn't present. Elena rationalized these behaviors as temporary adjustment issues, telling herself that Sombra simply needed more time to develop confidence before learning to interact appropriately with other humans. But late at night, reviewing her field notes and photographs, she couldn't ignore the growing evidence that her intervention had created a leopard who viewed her not as a temporary caregiver, but as his permanent family unit. The revelation came during a routine consultation with Dr. Patricia Hendricks, a renowned big cat behaviorist visiting from the Panthera Foundation. Elena had requested the evaluation under the pretense of seeking advice for Sombra's eventual release, but Dr. Hendricks' assessment delivered a harsh reality that Elena wasn't prepared to face. After observing Sombra for just 30 minutes, Dr. Hendricks pulled Elena aside with a grim expression. "This animal exhibits severe human imprinting," she said bluntly, reviewing her notes. "His attachment behaviors, territorial responses, and complete lack of appropriate fear responses toward humans indicate he's psychologically bonded to you as a surrogate mother figure. In 25 years of working with rescued big cats, I've rarely seen imprinting this profound." Elena felt her stomach drop as Dr. Hendricks continued her assessment. Leopards are solitary animals by nature. A healthy juvenile his age should be showing increased independence, practicing hunting behaviors, and developing the territorial instincts necessary for survival. Instead, he's displaying dependency behaviors typical of a domestic animal. This level of human attachment makes him completely unreleasable into the wild. The implications hit Elena like a physical blow. Everything she had done with the intention of saving Sombra's life had instead condemned him to permanent captivity. Dr. Hendricks explained that leopards with severe human imprinting often became dangerous as they matured, their natural predatory instincts conflicting with their attachment to humans in ways that could prove fatal for both parties. "I've seen cases where imprinted big cats became aggressive toward their primary caretakers during territorial disputes or mating seasons," Dr. Hendricks warned. "The animal doesn't understand human boundaries, and their affection can quickly turn violent when they feel threatened or frustrated. At his current size, Sombra could seriously injure or kill someone without intending harm." That evening, Elena sat alone in her office, staring at hundreds of photographs documenting Sombra's recovery. Each image told the story of her growing attachment, from clinical documentation shots to candid moments of play and affection. She had meticulously recorded his physical healing while completely missing the psychological damage she was causing. The weight of professional ethics crashed down on her as she realized the scope of her failure. She had violated fundamental principles of wildlife rehabilitation, allowing her emotional attachment to override scientific judgment. Her colleagues trusted her expertise, and she had betrayed that trust by prioritizing her own feelings over Sombra's welfare. The leopard she thought she was saving would now face a lifetime in captivity because of her selfish need to nurture and be needed. Elena spent sleepless nights researching alternatives, desperate to find a solution that wouldn't condemn Sombra to life behind bars. She contacted wildlife sanctuaries across 3 countries, consulted with animal behaviorists in Kenya and India, and even explored experimental rehabilitation programs designed specifically for human-imprinted big cats. Each conversation ended with the same devastating conclusion: leopards with Sombra's level of attachment rarely successfully transitioned to independent wild living. The internal struggle consumed her thoughts during every waking moment. When she looked at Sombra now, she saw not just the magnificent predator he was becoming, but the wild life she had stolen from him through her well-intentioned interference. His trust in her, once a source of pride and wonder, now felt like an accusation. Every purr, every gentle head bump, every moment of contentment in her presence served as evidence of her failure as a conservation professional. Dr. Martinez had begun pressuring Elena for a concrete release timeline, noting that Sombra's enclosure was needed for incoming rescued animals. The center's resources were stretched thin, and keeping a single leopard indefinitely wasn't sustainable. Elena found herself making increasingly desperate arguments for more time, claiming she was developing innovative rehabilitation techniques that just needed a few more months to prove effective. Her research revealed heartbreaking statistics about human-imprinted big cats. Most ended up in zoos or private sanctuaries, never experiencing the territorial ranges, hunting challenges, and social interactions that defined their species. Natural behavior. Some facilities reported that imprinted animals displayed chronic stress behaviors, repetitive pacing, self-mutilation, and depression that lasted for years. The lucky ones adapted to captivity, but they lived as shadows of what they should have been. Elena began consulting with psychologists who specialized in attachment disorders, hoping to understand if there were techniques to gradually reduce Sombra's dependence on her. The professional she spoke with painted a complex picture of breaking established bonds. The process would require Elena to systematically withdraw her presence and affection, essentially abandoning the creature who trusted her completely. The emotional trauma to Sombra could be severe, potentially triggering aggressive behaviors or complete withdrawal. As she weighed her options, Elena realized that every choice available to her involved causing Sombra pain. She could continue enabling his dependency, ensuring his permanent captivity, but maintaining their bond. She could attempt gradual separation, risking psychological damage and unpredictable behavioral changes. Or she could make the most difficult decision of her career, disappearing from his life entirely, trusting that his natural instincts might eventually resurface in her absence. Elena made her decision on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning, knowing that prolonging the inevitable would only deepen Sombra's attachment and her own anguish. She had spent the previous week gradually reducing her feeding schedule, hoping to ease the transition, but Sombra's distressed vocalizations during her absences confirmed that incremental separation would only cause prolonged suffering for both of them. On what she knew would be their final morning together, Elena entered Sombra's enclosure carrying his favorite enrichment toy, a rope with feathers that had occupied countless hours of their playtime. Now weighing nearly 60 pounds, Sombra bounded toward her with the enthusiasm that had become their daily ritual, unaware that everything was about to change forever. He performed his greeting ceremony, standing on his hind legs to place massive paws on her shoulders, his purring so intense it vibrated through her entire body. Elena sat cross-legged on the concrete floor, as she had done hundreds of times before, but this time she was memorizing every detail, the precise pattern of rosettes along his spine, the way his ears twitched when he was concentrating, the surprising gentleness of his massive paws when he needed her lap. Sombra settled beside her, draping his growing body across her legs with complete trust, occasionally looking up at her with golden eyes that held no suspicion of the betrayal to come. For 2 hours, Elena allowed herself to simply exist in their shared space, running her fingers through his thick fur and listening to his content rumbling. She spoke to him softly, explaining in words he couldn't understand that this separation was an act of love, not abandonment. When Sombra brought her a stick as an offering, she accepted it with the gravity of receiving a precious gift, tucking it into her pocket as a final memento. The hardest moment came when she stood to leave. Sombra immediately rose with her, expecting to escort her to the door as always. Instead of their usual brief goodbye, Elena knelt one last time, pressing her forehead against his in a gesture that had become their signature farewell. His purring intensified, and he licked her face with his rough tongue, completely trusting that she would return tomorrow as she always had. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Elena walked to the enclosure door without looking back, her hands shaking as she secured the lock. Through the reinforced glass, she could see Sombra sitting calmly, watching her with patient expectation. He had no way of understanding that the woman who had become his entire world was walking away forever, choosing his freedom over their bond. Elena submitted her resignation from the rehabilitation center that same afternoon, unable to bear the thought of working so close to Sombra while maintaining the necessary distance. She transferred to a marine conservation project on Colombia's Pacific coast, throwing herself into sea turtle research with desperate intensity, trying to drown out the memory of amber eyes that had trusted her completely. For 6 months, she refused all updates about Sombra's condition, knowing that any news would either devastate her with reports of his suffering or tempt her to return. The transition was reportedly brutal. Center staff described weeks of Sombra refusing food, pacing his enclosure frantically, and vocalizing with distressed calls that echoed through the facility day and night. But gradually, his natural instincts began to resurface. Without Elena's constant presence reinforcing his dependency, Sombra started showing interest in live prey introduced to his enclosure. His hunting behaviors sharpened, and most importantly, he began displaying appropriate wariness toward other humans, treating staff members as potential threats rather than sources of comfort. 3 years later, Elena's research work brought her back to the Colombian interior, studying jaguar populations in territories adjacent to the rehabilitation center. She had deliberately avoided any contact with her former workplace, but fate had other plans. While conducting a nocturnal survey in dense rainforest 40 kilometers from the center, Elena's headlamp failed, leaving her stranded in complete darkness with recent reports of armed poachers operating in the area. The sound of approaching voices and the unmistakable click of weapons being readied sent ice through her veins. Elena pressed herself against a massive cecropia tree, barely breathing as flashlight beams swept through the undergrowth around her position. The poachers were searching methodically, their Spanish conversations indicating they had spotted her research camp and were hunting for the person who might report their illegal activities to authorities. A low, rumbling growl emerged from the darkness above Elena's head, followed by the sound of claws scraping against bark. The flashlight beams immediately swung upward, revealing a magnificent male leopard crouched on a thick branch directly overhead, his rosette-spotted coat gleaming in the artificial light. The poachers, confident voices transformed into panicked shouts as they stumbled backward, abandoning their systematic search in favor of immediate retreat. The leopard dropped silently to the forest floor, padding close enough that Elena could see the familiar amber eyes that had once gazed at her with complete trust. Sombra had grown into a powerful predator, his muscles rippling beneath a coat that spoke of successful hunting and territorial dominance. For one impossible moment, their eyes met in mutual recognition before he melted back into the shadows, leaving Elena alone and safe in the darkness he now ruled. Elena remained motionless against the tree for nearly an hour after the poachers' retreat, her heart pounding as she processed what had just occurred. The sophisticated GPS tracking collar around Sombra's neck indicated he was part of an official release program, meaning her painful decision to abandon him had ultimately led to his successful reintegration into the wild. Seeing him as a free, fully functional predator defending his territory validated every sleepless night she had endured questioning her choice. When dawn finally broke through the canopy, Elena discovered evidence of Sombra's presence throughout the area. Scratch marks on trees marking territorial boundaries, the remains of a recent kill partially buried near a stream, and paw prints in the mud that told the story of a leopard living exactly as nature intended. The tracking data she later accessed through conservation databases revealed that Sombra had established a territory spanning over 50 square kilometers, successfully hunting wild prey and avoiding human contact except when protecting his domain from threats. The encounter transformed Elena's understanding of her role in conservation work. She realized that the greatest act of love she had ever performed was walking away from the creature she cared about most, trusting that his wild instincts would eventually overcome the artificial bond she had created. Her colleagues in marine conservation noticed the change in her approach to work, how she maintained necessary professional boundaries even when dealing with injured sea turtles or displaced marine mammals that tugged at her heartstrings. Elena began speaking at conservation conferences about the dangers of human imprinting, sharing her story as a cautionary tale for well-meaning researchers who might confuse rescue with relationship building. She emphasized that true conservation sometimes required making choices that felt cruel in the moment, but served the greater good of preserving wild behaviors and natural ecosystems. Her presentations always included photographs of Sombra during his rehabilitation, contrasted with trail camera footage of him hunting successfully in his natural habitat. Years later, Elena would occasionally detect signs of Sombra's presence during her research expeditions in the region, though she never attempted direct contact again. Camera traps captured images of him with a female leopard, evidence that he had successfully integrated into the complex social dynamics of his species. The knowledge that her difficult decision had given him the chance to experience courtship, territorial defense, and possibly raising cubs of his own, provided a profound sense of completion to their extraordinary story. The experience had taught Elena that sometimes the most loving thing one can do is step back and allow nature to reclaim what human interference had temporarily disrupted, trusting in the resilience of wild creatures to rediscover their authentic selves when given the space and opportunity to do so. Elena's story became a cornerstone case study in wildlife rehabilitation programs worldwide, demonstrating the complex balance between compassion and conservation ethics. She established the Sombra Foundation, dedicated to training wildlife rehabilitators in proper boundary-setting techniques and funding research into reversing human imprinting in rescued big cats. The foundation's logo featured the silhouette of a leopard disappearing into jungle shadows, symbolizing the ultimate goal of all conservation work, returning wild creatures to their natural state. 10 years after their final encounter, Elena received an unexpected email from a park ranger working in Sombra's territory. A trail camera had captured footage of him teaching two cubs to hunt, passing on the skills that should have come from his biological mother but had instead been learned through his own determination and instinct. The image of Sombra demonstrating a perfect stalking posture to his offspring, while they watched with the same amber eyes Elena remembered so well, brought tears to her eyes. The ranger's message included a remarkable detail. Sombra's territory bordered a village where children walked to school through forest paths, yet no leopard attacks had ever been reported. Local residents spoke of a guardian spirit that protected them from other predators while maintaining a respectful distance. Elena realized that Sombra had found a way to honor both his wild nature and the early lessons about coexisting peacefully with humans, becoming a protector rather than a threat. This incredible story proves that sometimes the hardest decisions lead to the most beautiful outcomes. True love isn't about holding on, it's about knowing when to let go and trust in something greater than ourselves. If Elena's journey with Sombra moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories about the unbreakable bonds between humans and wildlife. Hit that notification bell and share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that sacrifice and love often walk hand in hand. What would you have done in Elena's situation? Let us know in the comments below.